our children are 10 times more likely, or 10.8 times more likely to be removed, taken away from their families than non-Indigenous children. And our children are, I think it's 28 times more likely to be in correctional facilities, to be in prison than non-Indigenous children. Those disparities continue across the realm of health outcomes and housing. And so a big part of ANTAR and what we do is try to engage with everyday Australians to discuss what the business of reconciliation looks like, the unfinished business of reconciliation, and to explore some of the history, the really difficult history which wasn't told accurately for a long time, which gives some context to why we're in the position we are today. And perhaps most importantly, the role of all of us to contribute to moving us forward, as the Uluru Statement from the Heart speaks about, the offering, beautiful, heartfelt offering for all Australians to come together in a movement of the Australian people for a better future for all of us.
Welcome back to another episode of the Protect the World podcast. Every month, I connect with a different not-for-profit organisation that's making the world a better place. My goal is to learn about the issues they're tackling, interview the founder or director, and then share their stories with you. But I don't just want to share their stories. I want to contribute to their work as well. If you'd like to help me, you can sign up to the Patreon via the link in the show notes. The voice you heard at the beginning of this podcast belongs to Blake Cansdale, National Director of ANTAR. Founded in the late 90s, ANTAR has grown to become one of Australia's largest and most influential Indigenous advocacy groups, working across a broad range of issues, from native title and land rights to truth-telling and treaty. During this conversation, Blake and I discuss the organisation's history, the state of First Nations justice 1 year on from the Voice referendum, as well as recent changes to the age of criminal responsibility. Blake also reflects on where he draws strength from in these trying times and shares his vision for a fair and equitable Australia. ANTAR works tirelessly to create a better world, not just for Indigenous Australians, but for all of us. And I hope this conversation inspires you to get involved with their efforts. Apologies for the slight delay in the release of this episode. Time got away from me at the end of last month, and I've been on assignment in Peru for the last 2 weeks with very little free time. My audio is also a bit more echoey than usual. I recorded this conversation from a biological station in the Peruvian Amazon, and this was the only room that wasn't accompanied by a deafening chorus of frogs at the time. So please cut me some slack on that one. You'll also occasionally hear Blake's kids in the background of his audio. Blake joined me for this conversation just a few weeks after the birth of his third child, and I'm grateful that he was even able to find the time to chat with me during this period of beautiful chaos, as he describes it. Anyway, let's get on with the show. Here's Blake Cansdale, National Director of ANTAR. Blake Cansdale, a very warm welcome to the Protect the World podcast. How are you today?
I'm good, thanks, Brady. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming on. I'd like to start by asking, who are you and how do you describe yourself?
It's a question. Who am I? Constantly trying to figure that out. So I, first and foremost, I'm a proud N1 man. So my ancestral country as an Aboriginal man is up around Walker, Armidale in northern New South Wales. And given the nature of this podcast, I'd say New South Wales is a state of Australia. And N1 is it's a First Nations, one of the so my ancestors were First Peoples of Australia, and it's intertwined through my identity and everything that I've lived and breathed over the last, I won't mention exactly how old, but nearing 40, we'll say, of my life. What else is necessary to say? I'm a proud father, though exhausted father of 3, a 6-year-old, a 4-year-old, and a 4-week-old. So apologies if you hear some crying in the background.
4 weeks. Good on you for coming on, mate.
Yeah. It's beautiful chaos is what I liken life to now. It's tough, but it's what it's all about for me, at least. The legacy work in my private life, and as we'll talk through, throughout this discussion in my professional life as well. It's all about really leaving a positive legacy and hopefully leaving this planet a little better than when we first came into it. What else rounds out my professional experience? I guess it might be interesting. So I studied Bachelor of Law and a Bachelor of Science, majoring in psychology at the University of New South Wales. I went on to, after deciding forensic psychology wasn't going to be my thing, which I thought it was for most of my studies, decided to get into legal practice with real square focus on social justice. Being a First Nations man myself, it was just very natural. It was the obvious thing that I needed to do and leverage the privileged education I was receiving to actually give back. And again, we'll talk through more. It's mine. There's never been work for me. Well, obviously, it's work and can be a grind, but it's an honour to be doing something that's my cultural responsibility. It's a way in which I feel like I can give back to my people and fulfil my responsibilities to my ancestors and in the modern age. I graduated university, went into practice as a criminal solicitor with Legal Aid New South Wales. Spent a brief period with Aboriginal Legal Service before that. I don't want to labour on the point too much. So after practicing for a few years, predominantly in the children's court, I moved into... Actually, I went back and studied further because I wanted to be in a position where I was more involved in affecting systemic change, the design of policies and the shaping of institutions, rather than... I felt like being a practitioner in the court system. I was seeing the same kids, largely children, coming back with the same underlying issues, and I didn't feel like I was affecting a great deal of change in the role that I was in there. Whilst lawyers, solicitors, barristers, judges are an extremely important part of the system, it wasn't quite where I wanted to be. So I went back and studied Masters of Public Policy and Management. Found myself in the New South Wales government as a child protection policy worker, and worked as a policy lawyer with another legal institution, Law Council of Australia, for a period, and then shifted across to executive roles in Aboriginal community sector, a couple of prominent Aboriginal community-controlled organisations. And most recently, I find myself as the National Director of ANTAR, which is formerly Australians for Native Title and Reconciliation. And actually wearing a couple of hats at the moment. I'm also the acting National Director of a First Nations coalition called Change the Record, which we'll talk to in more detail what both of those entities are and the amazing, important work that they do.
Yeah, very much looking forward to the conversation. That was a great summary. And we'll be mainly focusing on ANTAR, but I'm keen to have a chat about justice and your work with Change the Record as well. So we'll get into the details of what ANTAR does in a moment. But firstly, how would you describe the purpose of the organisation? Why does ANTAR exist?
In short, we exist to achieve justice, rights and respect for First Nations peoples in Australia. Often people hear of self-determination for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and promoting sovereignty, things like economic empowerment. But there's a lack of understanding or depth to what those terms mean in practice. And that's our mandate at ANTAR, is to engage, particularly with wider Australian community, individuals, to help build an awareness around what the challenges are facing First Nations communities in achieving self-determination and in closing the gap, as many people would be familiar with the Closing the Gap framework. But at its heart, we're about promoting justice, rights and respect for First Nations peoples.
Fantastic. And tell me a little bit about ANTAR's history. What's the story behind the organisation?
Yeah, I'll do my best. I think I alluded to the fact before that I came into the role as National Director in March this year, so I'm still doing some learning in terms of our significant legacy myself, but I'll give you my understanding of the potted history. Nearly 3 decades advocating fiercely for First Nations people's rights. ANTAR started up in 1997. It was around the time of the beginning of the reconciliation movement under the father of reconciliation, Uncle Pat Dodson. So we are a not-for-profit, charitable organisation, community, say a grassroots community organisation that's independent of government and is focused, as I said, predominantly on the mobilising of wider Australian community around First Nations issues, be it the criminal legal system, the health, housing disparities, education, Aboriginal economic development opportunities or economic empowerment. And I'm sure we'll talk a bit further on maybe about our specific focus right now, where our strategic advocacy priorities are. But in short, yeah, we're a advocacy organisation and have been for nearly 30 years, advocating fiercely for what you might call reconciliation, but that's gone through, that's been operationalised or conceived of in different ways over that 30-year period. And we've been growing with that movement.
Yeah, there's some interesting terms that are sort of constantly evolving in that space, I imagine, as well. Could you give us a bit of an overview of the day-to-day at ANTAR? So what are the key issues that you're focusing on at the moment, and how do you go about it?
Sure. The day-to-day, so it struck me actually when I came into ANTAR, the quality of the output. The team is phenomenal. The policy submissions that we prepare, the communications, the lobbying, even the website itself. It screams of a well-oiled, well-funded, large organisation. I'd say well-oiled is correct. The funding we could do with far more funding is one of the massive challenges of many organisations like ours. Unfortunately, we're no exception there. Staff base is quite small, so from day to day I don't walk into a room with 20, 30, 40 staff. It's a relatively small team. Rely heavily on volunteers as well. So we are really proud of the organisation's ability to attract and retain long-term volunteers. So not just people coming in for a few weeks or months here and there. We've actually got volunteers that have been on the books for 5+ years, 7, 8 years, which I think is a real testament to the work culture at ANTAR and what we stand for, the passion that people bring to the job on the daily. Be it staff or volunteers. So a day on the job. Perhaps before moving to a specific day on the job, I'll mention the current strategic focus. So we had the benefit of just recently having gone through drafting our new and publishing our new strategic plan for the organisation. And the 4 top-line pillars or our strategic objectives are, and it's not in no particular order, the Uluru Statement from the Heart, in particular, as you can see on the shirt, so voice, treaty, truth, critical processes that are happening across Australia to varying degrees in the different states and territories, and there's massive implications for there was a constitutional referendum held 14th of October last year. We were we're definitely a significant stakeholder alongside other stakeholders, and we now are working really closely with the Uluru Dialogues. Auntie Pat Anderson and Megan Davis, co-chairs there, who are continuing to progress incredibly important work aligned with the Uluru Statement from the Heart, which is alive and well despite some of the conservative political pundits and media outlets trying to convince individuals that the vote last year on the referendum was a no vote for anything voice, treaty, truth related. Some of them going as far as saying, Australia's spoken on anything First Nations about. We don't really want to be hearing any of it anymore. It's not an area of priority. That is a complete misappropriation of what the vote was, which was strictly whether Australia supported a constitutionally enshrined First Nations voice to Parliament, to the Australian Parliament. It's a very distinct proposal and unfortunately didn't get the support that it needed to pass. And nonetheless, there's representative voice processes, there's treaty negotiation processes, and enormous truth-telling processes still progressing across Australia as we speak. And that's a key component of our ANTAR's focus, our advocacy focus, is supporting them and connecting those processes, First Nations-led processes, with wider Australia. So there's an awareness of what they are, their importance, and the role of allies and everyday Australians in ensuring or increasing the likelihood of the success of those processes. So that's the first pillar. Second pillar is the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, or UNDRIP in short. It's a international legal instrument, and it's been around for a long time. Unfortunately, it hasn't been codified. So whilst Australia ratified the UNDRIP after a period of not actually endorsing it, we were one of several countries. Kansas, I believe it was ourselves, perhaps Canada, New Zealand, was it United States as well? Anyway, a select few countries, and not surprisingly, those with a colonial history, didn't support UNDRIP at first. Thankfully, Australia, we did eventually get across the line and ratified it, but we haven't taken that extra and really critical step of codifying UNDRIP in domestic law, so taking the principles, which is all about the inherent and lived rights of First Nations peoples across the globe, and some really key articles in there in particular around sovereignty, the right of First Nations peoples to continuing sovereignty in their everyday lives, and free, prior, informed consent. So governments and non-Indigenous decision-making bodies not imposing decisions on First Nations communities without their informed consent, and nor is tokenistic consultation sufficient in order to design policies and develop legislative frameworks. We're moving away from that towards more participation decision-making and co-designing processes. So the importance of socioeconomic uplift is embedded in UNDRIP, and self-determination also speaks to the inherent right of First Nations peoples for self-determination. There's a whole raft of really critical foundational rights that should be informing government decisions around policy and legislation as a baseline. Unfortunately, if governments, national or state territory, do take reference from or draw influence from UNDRIP, it is only a light touch approach. Often it's certainly not drawn readily into legislation or so that's a big part of the work that we're also focused on at ANTAR at the moment, is seeing ideally an Australian human rights framework developed, short of a full comprehensive Australian Human Rights Act, is components, if not the entirety, certainly key components of UNDRIP integrated into state and territory legislation or various Commonwealth legislation.
Just to jump in quickly, if anyone would like to know more about UNDRIP and the concept of free, prior, and informed consent in a more international context, definitely check out my conversation with Galina Angarova and her work with the Surge Coalition from a few months ago. It was episode 13, and it was a really interesting discussion about how these concepts fit in around the transition to a green economy. Okay, back to the podcast.
The third pillar out of the four for us is priority First Nations policy. Priority First Nations campaigns. So ANTAR being a ally organisation, whilst in our near 30-year history, this is the first time ANTAR has actually got a Aboriginal man, myself, as the national director, and over 50% of our board is First Nations. So we're in an extremely powerful and unique stage in our history where we are closer than ever before, I would say, with our First Nations leaders and First Nations representative organisations in driving change for our communities. But the reality is that we still align ourselves closely with the priorities and the policy positions and the campaign activities of key First Nations organisations. I won't call any out specifically, but because ANTAR is national in scope, we come in closely alongside the First Nations national peaks, like the coalition of peaks, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peaks, NACHO, National Aboriginal Health, Community Health Organisation, NATSLS, and National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Legal Services, SNAKE, the Secretariat, National Aboriginal and Islander Childcare, so a range of all the national First Nations peaks. So that's the third. And the fourth pillar for us is really more about our strategic priorities, is more about doing close engagement with community, more education, awareness building about the realities of colonisation, the very dark and then sad reality of what colonisation has, the impact it's had on First Nations communities, and the extent of dispossession of our people, of our lands, the discrimination that's built in, overt racism historically, and then shifting towards more systemic racism and the effects that has had and continues to have on our communities, and starts to give hopefully individuals some understanding as to why this gross overrepresentation of our people in all the wrong places, statutory out-of-home care facilities, I believe, I might get these numbers wrong, sometimes flip these right. I think our children are 10 times more likely, or 10.8 times more likely to be removed, taken away from their families than non-Indigenous children. And our children are, I think it's 28 times more likely to be in correctional facilities, to be in prison than non-Indigenous children. Those disparities continue across the realm of health outcomes and housing. And so a big part of ANTAR and what we do is try to engage with everyday Australians to discuss what the business of reconciliation looks like, the unfinished business of reconciliation, and to explore some of the history, the really difficult history which wasn't told accurately for a long time, which gives some context to why we're in the position we are today, and perhaps most importantly, the role of all of us to contribute to moving us forward. As the Uluru Statement from the Heart speaks about, the offering, beautiful heartfelt offering for all Australians to come together in a movement of the Australian people for a better future for all of us, which is what it's ultimately about. It's, whilst we're exclusively First Nations focused in our advocacy, the reality is the vision that we have for the future is a better future for all Australians, no matter where we're from. Because my firm belief is the stronger we are, enduring custodians of country are, the stronger country will be, and the stronger everything that's connected to country will be. It's a bit of a lengthy pitch for our current strategic advocacy priorities at ANTAR.
That's fantastic. Yeah, that was a really good summary. I'm wondering if you could touch on that engagement with community a little more, and I guess I'm interested in that from the perspective of cultural heritage, which I know is another sort of focus area of ANTAR's. What types of things are we referring to when we talk about cultural heritage in a First Nations context, and how is ANTAR working to protect and enhance that?
Yeah, it's one of the difficulties working in a space where often you're expected by many people to be an expert on all things at all times, to all people. I wouldn't profess to be an expert on cultural heritage. It certainly is a core priority of ANTAR's, alongside the other areas of the criminal legal system, child family wellbeing, or child protection system, whilst I wouldn't say that that's what it does in effect. Health, housing, education, all of those things mentioned before, economic development or economic empowerment. So I'll do my best. I can't say I've got extensive experience with cultural heritage specifically, though I did have some tangential, closely related experience working in an Aboriginal Land Council in New South Wales, where there was a core responsibility of our Land Council to identify, protect, preserve and celebrate cultural heritage, but equally as part of our economic development platform, to build a resource base for our community, we had to navigate the complexities of the planning system and how cultural heritage is managed within the planning system. So what's cultural heritage? I think is a very, very, for me anyway, poorly conceived of thing, and often the way that it's dealt with in legislation is almost liken it to a museum piece. It's a real shame that a lot of Australians and the conception of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander culture, and certainly what any value that's placed on our culture and our history and our people, is more around ancient artifacts and country that has some ancient value where it's perceived of as needs to be preserved and put away in a glass case, and that's what culture is, and that's the most important and valuable component of Aboriginal history and culture, Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander history and culture. Whilst that's critically important, absolutely critical, that the cultural heritage sites, artifacts, landmarks, songlines, legislation and governments and everyday Australians work to identify those sites or those artifacts and preserve them and utilise them to educate on the history. Equally important for me, I wouldn't say more important, but I'll say equally important, is understanding that culture is very much alive. First Nations culture is very much alive and it's all around us. So cultural heritage seen as a point in time, static, historical object or area is, for me, a misframing of a poor framing of what culture is in contemporary Australia. And our cultural heritage is a living thing. Our culture is a living thing. Our people are. We're growing, and there's challenges with some of these carvings. If you go out and you check out a site, thousands of year old carvings. That was our classrooms. Like our kids and our elders, were using those sites to teach. And still today, that I can't speak to the practices. It's so variable across the nation. I can only speak to my experience in small areas and what I've learned of other areas, but I know that it's alive and well. So we're doing a lot of important work, extremely important work, mob all across First Nations communities, all across Australia to reclaim what was, tried to be taken from us for a long time. And that resilience is just so core to our being, and it always has been. It's a very, very difficult to be met with no and resistance and oppression for generations, but to remain strong in the face of that and to grow. And yeah, that's something that I think is really beautiful and powerful about First Nations people, and it's a real honour to do the work that we do at ANTAR with our First Nations orgs and First Nations leaders. And cultural heritage is absolutely one of those areas where there's a lot of education to happen with governments and with individuals about what it means, the importance of protecting it, but shifting the definition of cultural heritage from, like I said, that static historical conception to, well, no, the beautifully rich and the beautiful depth of First Nations culture is a living thing, and that needs to be understood. And I feel like integrated into broader legislative frameworks, and more relevantly, just the everyday lived experience of individuals, everyday Australians. I think the more we can draw from First Nations worldview, First Nations culture, our conception of country, and that deep sense of interconnectedness to all things at all times, it creates this sense of belonging and responsibility that, unfortunately, I think is lacking in a lot of areas that everyone's rather the system sort of set up to make us very self-focused and largely competitive. We're competing with others for limited resources to get ourselves ahead. Very different conception of country and our place in country that First Nations people hold, and I think it's far healthier in terms of ensuring the sustainability of our planet long term, and creating just a more engaged collective stronger community or society in Australia.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree. I think we're on the same page, sort of philosophically, that big picture level. I'd just like to jump back to what you said about culture and cultural heritage sort of evolving. I was wondering if you've come across any sort of interesting examples of how First Nations cultural heritage is changing currently, and I guess particularly among young Indigenous Australians.
Hmm. Yeah, it's tough. Given it depends on how you, yeah, like I said before, how you conceive of cultural heritage. Um, in New South Wales, in the state that I'm in, there is a large group and a growing group of First Nations men that have been reclaiming culture through more of a traditional lens. In a lot of, from my understanding at least, a lot of these individuals have experienced a significant degree of disconnect from their identity as an Aboriginal man and their culture by virtue of the history of that dispossession and dislocation and the reality, particularly in New South Wales, ground zero for colonisation, is such a significant impact that the colonial project has had on our communities, and it's manifested in quite a bit of a disjoint for a lot of Aboriginal people in New South Wales. Not all, but a lot. And yes, this group, they're getting back out on country. I believe it's statewide. It may have even grown more broadly. But the idea is periodically coming together and just getting out on country and slowing down and connecting and going to particular sites. And as I mentioned before, not through like an academic lens or not, it's not like it's not like sort of a Bible class to have this linear process of learning about culture and being able to regurgitate facts about how our ancestors lived. And it's not like that. It's more a to feel out and connect with country and to learn from elders and elders that have been through that have been sitting with that longer and been learning from cultural knowledge holders that have fed down to them and trying to re-establish in at least New South Wales, because this is, I can't speak to other areas around Australia, it's very much still strong, is that the traditional frame of how culture manifests for different communities. But in areas of New South Wales, like I said, there's this group that are, and largely young men that are searching for that identity and that strength in identity and understanding of cultural practices, and are utilising that connection with country to go out on country and go to some of these sites and carvings in particular and learn the stories and use them again, re-enliven them as current day classrooms, to reinvigorate some more the traditional model of developing intelligence. So we think of IQ and academic intelligence. This is really what intelligence was, I guess, historically, was understanding of culture and country and our responsibilities to each other. And that, I think, is a really powerful, beautiful example of trying to reclaim space that was taken from or attempted to be taken by others through the process of colonisation. And it's redefining, I guess, in a way, what cultural heritage is and the significance of country and some of these sites to our people, particularly our young ones. It's a really strong thing in terms of a legacy for growing our young ones strong.
Brilliant. That sounds great. You mentioned earlier that you're also the acting director at Change the Record currently. I'd like to turn now to the issue of incarceration and justice, particularly in relation to youth detention. There's been some recent changes to legislation in Victoria and in the NT, a clear step backwards in the NT, and I guess a step in the right direction in Victoria, but certainly not what was expected or required. Firstly, could you give us a bit of an overview of the state of Indigenous incarceration in general, and then perhaps share your thoughts regarding those recent changes to the age of criminal responsibility?
Sure. I should be scrubbed up on the statistics. I haven't read them for a little bit of time though. So on last reading, We tend to try to look beyond the numbers, and it's more about the lived experience and the human realities of the systems and the oppressive nature of criminal legal systems and policies and legislative frameworks. But in terms of numbers, I believe we're looking at it's around 50% of the juvenile detention population, so children, young people, children under 18 within Australia are First Nations children, where it's important to reflect on what we represent as a total percentage of the population. I believe we're around 3.4% of the total population, slightly higher for children. So we have a slightly higher or larger youth population, but irrespective, we represent a small, very small portion of the overall Australian population. Yet we represent, as I said, I believe it's around 50% of the juvenile detention population. The last reading, it's in the mid 20%, low to mid 20% of the adult male prison population. Actually increases when looking at the female adult prison population. It's sitting more around the 30, but perhaps just north, low 30% of the prison population is our First Nations women, which is abhorrent. And there's incredibly strong links to well evidenced and accepted links between the out-of-home care or child protection systems, the overrepresentation that we see in child protection and statutory out-of-home care, and the link between that and juvenile detention, and just the complete failings of criminalising behaviour of our children and imprisoning them, bringing them into the criminal legal system. All it does is really increase the likelihood of recidivism, or increase the likelihood of them offending. So the strong links between the juvenile detention population and the overrepresentation that we see in adult correctional facilities. Yeah, and so beyond talking of statistics, what else did you?
Just in terms of the recent changes to criminal responsibility, age of criminal responsibility.
Yeah, it's hard to talk to without getting emotional. It's challenging times. I feel like on a macro scale, we're seeing a shift, quite a significant shift in certainly some conservative politics and government. I would hope to think it's not societal, it's not community-wide, around particularly tough on justice kind of policies. But we saw after the referendum last year, the failure of the referendum last October certainly seems to be a growing emboldening of conservative media outlets and conservative politicians to try to effect further regress of First Nations policy. And a lot of the amazing work that we've done, the fantastic advancements and positive steps that we take in the last 20, 30 years, and the foundation, the platform that was set by some of our staunch elders, particularly through the 50s, 60s, 70s, activists that laid the foundation for us to start to significantly improve the circumstance for our communities. Not nearly significantly enough, because those, as we've seen with the Closing Gap report since its inception, a lot of those gaps aren't closing and some even worsening. Nonetheless, there were examples, really positive examples of reconciliation in practice and moving us towards genuine self-determination for First Nations peoples in Australia. Unfortunately, we seem to be facing a bit of a regression at the moment, and it's not just locally, it seems to be occurring globally. Still haven't quite landed where exactly that is coming from, but it's dangerous. And one of the periods in Australia, there's multiple periods throughout our history, colonial history anyway, the last 230 odd years since colonisation. There was a period that's referred to as assimilation period after the killing times, and there was a protectionist era. But assimilation, effectively, these government-designed policies to force the assimilation of all First Nations, all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples into the Australian way of living and being. And basically disregarding or eliminating anything that it meant to be a First Nations person in Australia, and our culture, our language, our traditions, to relinquish all of that and fold into the model of being a model Australian. Stolen generations were a perfect example of that, as governments actively enacting legislation that allowed or led to the large-scale stealing, taking of our children from our families and communities with a view to placing them in institutions and sorry to use this terminology, but breeding the black out of them is effectively what they were trying to achieve. Those periods in our history need to be understood, and not just in a historical context, but really importantly in terms of what impact they've had, the lasting impact, and how they play out today still in the overrepresentations that we're talking about. Unfortunately, the linkage there is I'm seeing some of that divisive rhetoric and outright sort of assimilationist ideology bubbling to the surface again through some conservative media outlets and some of the emboldened politicians and the way that they speak to First Nations issues. It has me concerned that we're not even, I think you used the terminology, took a step backwards in the Northern Territory with the minimum age of criminal responsibility. I feel like it's potentially larger scale than that and far more grave if that is in fact what we're facing here. So, and I don't believe wider Australia wants that. I don't believe the everyday citizen is inclined to want to see that kind of regression and reverting us back to just awful, archaic mindsets and inhumane practices from 30, 40 years ago. Unfortunately, it just seems to be finding a place within current politics and certainly media. So you pointed out a perfect example of this. No more is it more obvious in Australia than with the Northern Territory government, the recent move to lower the minimum age of criminal responsibility from down to 10 years of age. It's not just that though. They've what have they done? So they either have reintroduced, or they're about to reintroduce, or propose and reintroduce public drunkenness laws, which will have a disastrously discriminatory effect on our communities in the Northern Territory, and were repealed years ago for very, very good reason. And there's other states and territories as well looking to introduce really conservative and I'd say racially motivated reforms around introducing truancy officers and reintroducing the use of spit hoods for our children in correctional facilities. These are all things that can have disastrous consequences. There's no evidence to suggest these kind of interventions and tough on crime approaches to law and order responses to what are social and health-based issues are going to have any positive effect. None whatsoever. We're well beyond any kind of claims that imprisoning young children is for their benefit, whilst still the government likes to say so. And in fact, in the Northern Territory government, there's the key representative, I believe it was only last week, saying that they needed to lower the minimum age so they could intervene in children's lives sooner to provide the kind of support that they need. It's such an outrageous claim that we need to criminalise our children's behaviour and institutionalise them in order to give them the support that they need to live a full, meaningful life. I'll use the term again, it's perverse. What we need is much greater investment, prioritisation of preventative services, targeted early intervention, community-based solutions in respect of our First Nations communities, First Nations-led community-based solutions, things like familial supports and the kind of amazing justice reinvestment work that's going on around the nation. That's the solution. The solve isn't criminalising our kids, increasing their contact with police, bringing them into, imprisoning them, putting them in correctional facilities, even having them sit in adult correctional facilities. Yeah, unfortunately, that's what we're dealing with in some states and territories at the moment, and that's a difficult task that ANTAR has alongside particularly our First Nations justice advocacy organisations to work with those governments and work with the Commonwealth Government as well as a significant opportunity, or I'd say responsibility of the Commonwealth Government to um, step up and show some leadership around justice for our children in if no other reason, by virtue of the Convention of the Rights of the Child and international law establishing the responsibilities that we have to ensure the protection and the well-being of our children. I think there's a lot to be said about the role that the Commonwealth Government can play in working with the states and territories to ensure that we focus our energies in the right areas to give our young ones the start to life that they deserve to go on to live a full, engaged, strong, happy, grounded life rather than continue to experience this intergenerational trauma that far too many of our kids and our families are exposed to.
Absolutely. Yeah, that was a really good summary of the state of affairs currently, and also some of the really important solutions that need to be implemented. I'd like to frame the next couple of questions around the Uluru Statement, and I guess I'd like to start with the voice. So, as you mentioned, it's been just over a year since the referendum, and you recently shared a blog post titled 1 Year On, The Good, the Bad and the Ugly. So, firstly, if you could just give a really quick summary of what the Uluru Statement is and why we had a referendum for our international listeners. And then tell us about the good, the bad, and the ugly over the last year.
Yeah, I'm reticent to be the one to speak to this. So I feel like I would love to offer the opportunity to individuals that the architects of the Uluru Statement and that led the charge in terms of the regional dialogues and the extensive conversation that happened around Australia with First Nations peoples that resulted in the Uluru Statement being endorsed itself, because it ultimately it's important to know, and a lot of people don't know this, unfortunately, is that it constitutes the single largest consensus of First Nations peoples for a proposal for substantive change in Australia's history. It's the largest coming together of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples on a particular proposal, in our history, and that should carry a significant weight. And it's not to suggest that every Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander person agrees with the approach or the principles, and I'll talk a bit more to the relationship, but the distinction between the Uluru Statement and the referendum last year. Unfortunately, that was weaponised though during the referendum. The fact that there are, and rightly so, individuals that didn't see that as the pathway for self-determination or progress for our people, and still don't to this point. As much as any other Australian, our communities, us as individuals, we have our own perspective on things. We have our own lived experience, and we have the right to view things in a different manner. And you're not going to get a unanimous position on anything, such as the nature of human psychology and behaviour, particularly something as enormous as a constitutional reform proposal. There was always going to be a dissenting view or multiple. The important thing to reflect on is that was by far the significant minority. I believe the numbers I was talking about was like over 80+% of First Nations peoples in support of, and certainly we'll just say it was an overwhelming majority that supported the proposal, and no more so than in remote communities in various areas. So it's really unfortunate that during the referendum, one of the things that was weaponised by the No campaign was part of this mis and disinformation, which we can talk a bit to, which was disastrous for the Yes campaign, and really muddied the waters, and I'd say in a large way undermined the referendum being genuinely representative of what Australia thought on the proposal. Yeah, one of the things that was weaponised was this idea that even First Nations people didn't want it, and just because a handful of individuals, and won't name names, but there's a couple of prominent political figures in particular that were displayed all over TVs and newspapers and radio, were rolled out as examples of representative voice for First Nations peoples. And whilst there was a cohort, individuals that didn't support it, there was by far a much greater majority that did, and it's still to this point. That's on the referendum. Stepping back, though, as I said before, the Uluru Statement from the Heart, which was the precursor, or that would inform the basis for the referendum proposal, is the largest consensus of First Nations peoples in our history on a proposal for standing for reform. So it's got enormous significance. It's First Nations led, as I mentioned, the Uluru regional dialogues. Sorry, there was a extensive process of travelling around Australia and engaging with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities to inform the Uluru Statement. And ultimately, the principles, the key top-line principles of the statement are voice, Aboriginal, the importance of Aboriginal representative voice, and in particular, the idea of a voice, a national representative body. And the proposal, actually, the Uluru Statement actually speaks to the need for that to be constitutionally enshrined, to speak on all matters of policy, major law and policy reform that impacts First Nations peoples. The idea of nothing about us without us, it makes sense to me, and I'm sure it makes sense to most people. They could understand the importance of having individuals that are affected by the decisions of government, having them at the table when those particular policy instruments or legislation is being drafted to inform that process. That was, in essence, the nature of the voice proposal within the Voice Treaty Truth within Uluru Statement from the Heart, was a constitutionally enshrined First Nations voice to Parliament. The reason, important to note that we have voice, we have always had voice. We have representative voice all over Australia. There's all sorts of Aboriginal representative organisations that represent our people and influence government decision-making, directly engaged in partnership with government. The difference with this is that we were looking at a constitutionally enshrined voice, and indeed we have had similar such bodies, not constitutionally enshrined historically. I think things along the lines of the National Aborigines Conference, I'm not sure if you say National Aborigines Consultative Committee, but certainly ATSIC, National Congress, Australia's First Peoples. We had several entities over history which was a representative voice for our people nationally, and they were ultimately shut down invariably by a conservative government at the time that either just didn't like what the work that they were doing, or took issue with the way it was structured. And I won't guess at the various reasons, particularly government decided to shut down these entities. But the lesson to understand, I guess, is that without that protection of being constitutionally enshrined, those voices, those representative bodies, and I dare say we will have one set up again, hopefully in the near future, at a national level, will be subject to the whims of the government of the day. Could be defunded or shut down through legislative reform. So it's very much at risk. Whereas that important element of protecting a voice so it could be speaking frank and fearlessly on these issues from a First Nations perspective was the constitutional protection. So that's why the Uluru Statement from the Heart had that focus on having a constitutionally enshrined voice to Parliament. The sequence was important as well. As the idea was to have that in place to speak on as a policy and law reform that affected our people's rights and interests. What was misunderstood in the subsequent referendum, one of the things is that voice wouldn't have a veto power. It wouldn't actually be able to force the government to make particular decisions or be able to prevent certain law reform or policy from happening. It was ultimately just a right to provide advice to the government on certain matters. Whether the government heeded that advice or not, it's entirely a matter for the government of the day. So they could have ultimately just completely ignored the advices they were receiving. So any Australians that thought it was giving too much power or giving too unique a position for First Nations peoples in Australia, former Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull, I believe he likened it to a third chamber of Parliament. Whether that's a misinterpretation or a misinformation. Unfortunately, it was misunderstood that this entity perhaps would have much greater power than some Australians were willing to support. It wasn't the case. It was an incredibly important step forward, but ultimately it was just another component of setting our First Nations communities up for addressing the deeply entrenched disadvantage and that intergenerational trauma and disparity that exists. Having a national representative voice is a critical part of that, to ensure that governments are doing the right things by our communities at all parts of the system. And so that voice, then treaty was the next logical step, and truth telling. They're really intertwined, treaty and truth telling, and arguably truth telling belongs at all parts and has been happening for a long time. And we'd need a whole other session to talk to the nuance, the complexities of treaty processes and truth telling. Suffice to say, they're happening across the state, across various states and territories. Victoria in the south of Australia is the most pertinent example. The First Peoples Assembly of Victoria have been progressing their treaty negotiations with the state government there for, I'm going to say, 8 years or so. It's a long-term process, and they're just nearing the point of entering genuine negotiations, sitting down at the table to start to talk treaty proper, negotiations proper. Alongside them is the York Justice Commission that's been running a truth-telling commission with Royal Commission powers for the last, again, I think it's between 3 and 5 years. I think 4 or 5 years. They sit alongside each other, critical components of progressing our people's rights and interests, and the truth-telling is a big part of creating a foundation of understanding from wider Australia around our shared history between non-Indigenous and First Nations peoples, but not just historical stuff. The truth-telling around the reality of our culture and how I was saying before is very alive and well today, and how the reality, what it means for all people to be living on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander land, and our responsibilities to each other and country, and the vision we have for our shared future is perhaps the most potent part of recognising the past injustices and how we can ensure that we move towards a brighter future is for me a big part of that. Truth-telling is very relational. Where things rubber really hits the road is taking that knowledge and understanding and incorporating it into how we build relationships with those around us, and reflect on our own place in our areas in society, and how we leverage that for creating a better future to leave a positive legacy. They're the three core elements of the Uluru Statement of the Heart: voice, treaty, truth. The referendum was not successful. That was specifically a constitutionally enshrined voice to Parliament, the proposal. That does not mean at all one bit that treaty processes or truth-telling processes were not supported by wider Australia, and in fact they are very much progressing. Much like the criminal legal systems, though, some of the regressive policies of certain conservative governments, treaty and truth-telling processes are also at risk at the moment, and it's really important organisations like ANTAR and Uluru Dialogues and reconciliation community groups and just allies generally of First Nations peoples that we get behind those processes and try to protect them from certain we'll just say conservative Australia that would like to see them closed down, which I don't think is nearly representative of the majority of Australians, that if they only understood more about what they meant, the significance and the beautiful and necessary place of those processes, would be fully supportive. And that's what the Uluru Statement was. It was an offer to the Australian people to embark on a movement of the Australian people for a better future for all. It was very much, it wasn't an offer to the government as previous offers have been, that the Yikala state, the Barunga Statement and the Yikala petition and various other proposals have been direct to government and offers to government, and this was an offer to the Australian people. It was about recognising our collective belonging and creating a future that we can be proud of, that we can bring our kids and kids' kids into.
Absolutely. I'd like to shift focus to you as an individual now, if that's all right, Blake. Tell me a little bit about the environment you grew up in. What was your upbringing like?
It's pretty, pretty relatively privileged, I'd say. I'm going to say pretty average, sort of middle class Australian kind of upbringing, but as I've gotten older and more experienced and more astute with what's going on around the world, I now realise a relatively privileged upbringing. And what I mean by that is I had a stable home, had a loving mother and father that were together and supported myself and my sister. It was just me and my sister on the central coast of New South Wales. I lived right near a beach, so I was lucky to have some of the most gorgeous coastline in the world right at my doorstep. So I grew up a saltwater boy, and that's a privilege in itself. My mum was a teacher's aide. My father was a firefighter. So I guess not a telling part of that, but I was actually first generation to, I believe I maybe go past year 10. I think I might have had an uncle, aunt that might have gone to year 12, but certainly the first generation to go to university, which I struggled with a little bit in the early days of university. I was so going from an environment where I distinctly remember the last time I got support for one of my projects or school-based activities was not because of a lack of desire. My parents would have loved to, but academically, I guess it was around year 6. I did a project on bats. It was one of the last times I really turned to my parents in a comprehensive way to assist with something school-based. From that point on, it was really off my own back, which is great to develop that independence and that autonomy, I guess. But it was challenging, particularly as I came out of high school and stepped into university, studying law at one of the preeminent universities in Australia, and surrounded by individuals that, not all, but many, clearly had grown up in a very different circumstance where, sort of, generations of lawyers in the family and doctors and engineers, and sat at a dinner table for dinner, let alone sat at a dinner table and spoke about all manner of politics and, economic circumstance, things that I'm not sure I've had a single conversation with my parents about that stuff growing up. It was interesting to have to forge my own path with developing an awareness of politics and economics and social justice in that sense, but I realised the base I had of that unconditional support from my parents was the most important thing that they could have given, and the stability they had in my house. And grew up really happy, playing a lot of sport, being down the beach a lot. I was riding cricket and AFL and rode surf boats for years, and the parents would always show up every weekend. They dedicated to all manner of and weeks through training and playing sport, and I think that kept me on the straight and narrow, whereas a few of my friends that I grew up with had a bit more time on their hands, not playing sport as much, and spent a bit more time down the skate park, and decided to go in different paths. It's funny how I ended up with two distinct cohorts of friends whom I love dearly, both of them, but very different. A group that stayed very much local on the Central Coast and became tradies, and funnily enough, actually, by virtue of becoming tradies and not going to university, now own their home or multiple homes and have beautiful families and aren't paying off astronomical, what they call it, help fee debts or like university fees. Whereas my other group of friends decided to go down the travel path, decided early, as I did myself. I wanted to go explore the world, so I packed my bag when I was 18 and 19 and spent 18 months travelling around, backpacking around Europe. just asking all manner of questions of myself and of the world, and trying to soak up as much as I could before I came back. And I guess so, I moved into that next stage of life of having children and a mortgage and the weight of responsibility of being an adult. Privileged to say through my 20s that I managed to sneak in a lot of travel. And I spent collectively, I think, another 18 months in Central America. Had some really amazing experiences from my 20s, which I think is an integral part of making me who I am today. It helped me to become more well-rounded and respectful, and just gave me depth as an individual. But between that and my culture, I feel a deep sense of privilege for the life that I've had, certainly.
It sounds like you really looked up to your parents. Were there any other key role models you had growing up, particularly in that sort of high school and university space?
This actually saddens me when I think about this over the years. It doesn't come up often, but I wonder if I did be disappointing and devastating anyone by saying so. Not really. Yeah, it seems really, honestly, I wish I did. I wish I had examples where I'd drawn heavily from mentors and come under the wing of certain family members, or even close friends or friends' families. Or no, I don't know. I think something in me, either biologically, my ancestors were watching over me and gave me the strength alongside my parents, as I say, unconditional support and love and affection, and it gave me the strength of conviction that I was able to just forge on with life, just get on with things and do it off my own back. Constantly putting myself in circumstances that I feel well beyond my capability, but I lent in. I've always sort of had a sense of I don't know, give it a red hot go and see how things turn out. And I think that's a big challenge, big part of this imposter syndrome that a lot of us have that prevent us from having just making that attempt. And thankfully, things in my life have given me the confidence to just sometimes take the risk and sit with that uncomfortability. And I've been able to work through the reservations I've had, or the anxiety, or that self-judgment, not feeling good enough for certain environments. And early days university really helped me with that, I think. Being thrust in an environment with some of the most intelligent individuals in Australia studying law and whatnot, and feeling so inadequate and out of my depth, that really helped me to, I guess, develop the resilience and confidence to realise I'm good enough and I have worth no matter what environment I'm in. And importantly, not to feel above or below anyone. That we've all got our, challenges in life and our strengths and our weaknesses, and we're all beautiful at the end of the day and have our role to play. So, so there's no individual, there's no standout, unfortunately. I would have loved to have had someone I could say was my champion. I put it down to my parent, the base I got from my parents and the ancestors looking after us, I guess.
Brilliant. I guess sort of related to that, the way you sort of tackle the work that you do and that kind of thing. I imagine the work you do is often quite difficult, quite confronting. It can weigh pretty heavy on the heart. And yet, from what I've seen, you've got a pretty sort of fierce optimism, determination about you. I feel like there must be days where it's a struggle to get out of bed. I don't know, maybe not. Maybe that fire's just always there. But how do you go about navigating all of that, and where do you reckon your drive comes from?
Yeah, it's a good question. No, I mean, sometimes, quite regularly these days, it is a struggle to get out of bed. That's for a different reason, though. That's physical exhaustion from the reality of being a parent of three gorgeous but challenging young children. It's funny though. Therein lies the rub. I think that's why it's not an option. I can't give up. I think deep down, I just know and feel. Seeing the, almost, to use terms I really don't like, but might resonate with people. The intractable or wicked nature of the issues that we're dealing with, in First Nations affairs, and the devastating reality. It's just, really saddening. Does bring me to tears increasingly as I get older and more connected into my core identity and my place in the world and my feelings. I do find myself increasingly emotionally affected by the stuff I'm involved in and read and experience. I'm really pleased to say, though, at no point does that make me falter, or has it to date, at least, touch wood, made me falter in my commitment to and passion and just unwavering sort of thought that knowing, it's not a thought, knowing that this is my path, this is where I'm at. It's, so no, I haven't to date, at least. Post-referendum was a slog, I have to say. And yes, there's periods of like slight bumps, dips in the road of my own personal conviction, but it's never gotten me to the depths of that give up territory. I've lost all hope, or what's the point? That fire is always, if anything, it just like it douses the fire, it stokes the fire. The greater the challenges, the greater the resistance, the greater the seeming impossibility, the more I'm like, I need to be bigger. I need to be more in order to counter that. So if anything, it almost fuels the place that I feel. In terms of what it might have come from, I mentioned before that the ancestors looking over me. I think it's from a depth, whether it's known. I don't think I even know consciously, or nor could speak in words to where that conviction comes from. Then that optimism and that fire, that just unconditional, unwavering commitment that I have to what I'm growing into. It's not like I've got this all mapped out either. I've said for a lot of my career, my CV is quite. It's jumped around a lot. It's moved around. It's quite colourful. It's always within First Nations affairs, but I move between child protection and the criminal legal system, adult education, land rights, and from advocacy for the most part to now still advocacy, but like a really strong focus on campaigning. So it's not like I've got it all mapped out, and there's this, articulate, meticulous kind of knowing of where I'm going. I've always been pretty good at setting some mid-range and long-term goals, but then letting go of the here and now, just really trying to immerse myself in the moment. I think the travels are a big part of helping frame that up for me, of accepting that the most beauty you can get in life is from freeing yourself of the constraints of worrying about future stuff and being smart about setting, for me, and I'm talking from my own experience perspective, setting a frame for what you want to be and where you want to go and what the future looks like, but ultimately liberating yourself from those anxieties and stresses of having too strict a path where you can just immerse yourself in the current state. That's been a big part of my sort of approach to life and thing, and it has led to a lot of doors opening and me being prepared to say yes to a lot of those opportunities rather than shutting them down because it's not necessarily on my quote unquote on my path. It's where I guess I feel that if it's a fit, a natural fit, and I've got quite a broad frame for what that looks like, and the impact proposition, that's where I feel like the privilege that I have had in my life of the, as I mentioned, my familial support, my upbringing, my educational opportunities. So that's some amazing education and career opportunities. That gives me increasingly over the course of my adult life, that has given me an increasing sense of responsibility, deep sense of responsibility to leverage that for the betterment of, the world around me. I'm acutely aware that the opportunities I've had and the life I've experienced, a lot of other individuals don't get near, and I feel like it's my responsibility. I've been gifted that. I need to utilize that to try and shift the circumstance, and hopefully in future there are far more, particularly our communities and our kids, that have access to those kind of experiences that I've had, and can live a kind of, pretty amazing, rounded, colourful life that I've managed to squeeze in, at least in this physical, conscious life that I'm living right now. We perhaps won't foray into my views on reincarnation and traditional view, and I don't feel like this is the first time I've been here and done this. That's maybe a topic for another podcast.
I'd love to chat about it. I'm just aware of your time. I don't think we'll get through it.
Yeah, but cultural responsibility is, I think that's the driving force. The ancestors and my deep sense of cultural responsibility, where it's 2024. I live in contemporary Australia, just a heartbeat away from metropolitan Sydney. Culture is very much alive and around me, but and I'm a part of it. But in terms of traditional cultural practices, culture doesn't manifest as much here, at least. It does in other parts of Australia in a really traditional frame, in terms of traditional law and cultural protocols. And for me, a big part of how I connect with the ancestors and fulfill my responsibilities is through what I do with myself in my everyday lived experience, and very much so through my work, driving positive change. And that's what gives me that base. That's why it's unwavering, and it's not a matter of choice. It just is and will be till I die, I'd say.
Brilliant. I love that response. Getting towards the end of the questions, what advice would you give to young Indigenous Australians who are interested in pursuing the kind of work that you do?
I feel like I'm a caveat that you got to everyone's got their own unique path, and I would never profess to be acutely aware in a lived experience kind of way of the circumstance of a lot of kids in different communities. And so I can only speak from my personal lived experience, and obviously I've got deep insight into a lot of different kind of lived circumstance of our First Nations children across Australia, not just through the advocacy work I've done, but equally out in community. I spent some time, and still some of the most beautiful experiences I've had, and powerful, also confronting, working in remote communities in the Northern Territory during my university days, actually, when I was young. Probably remiss of me not to mention that before. That was quite a formative experience in itself, spending months at a time out in various remote communities around the Territory, working with children between the school semesters. Wow, that was really amazing. The good, the bad, and the ugly again. And the good is too often overlooked, unfortunately. There's so much beauty that I extracted from that experience. I just wish a lot of Australians were able to have that hands-on, where you can touch, feel, and smell what it's all about. It's not academic, or it's certainly not a news segment, something that they read in the newspaper or they have delivered via a media, TV channel. That's one of the big challenges for ANTAR, is how we create space, environments where people can connect with these issues on a real lived everyday experience, and we can start to change hearts and minds. Creating that collective sense of belonging and place and responsibility. This isn't just a subject matter or a theoretical area. It's all of our responsibility to contribute to that betterment of our First Nations communities. So, having said that very long disclaimer as to what advice I'm about to give now is very much from my own lived experience, and may not be at all applicable to a lot of mob. I'd say believing in yourself. If only they've got someone, which I hope they would for the most part, that gives them a sense that they are good enough and can do whatever they want. I think it's genuinely true. If only you can just find that confidence within self to say yes to opportunities. Don't expect to go from, I don't know, not to be low, creating sort of a sense of low expectations, was dropping out in year 10 to becoming Prime Minister of Australia within 10 years. Setting practical goals, but not having reservations about going big. I think that's a big thing. Dream big, and there are a lot of opportunities there. There's a lot of barriers, and again, I can't profess to know firsthand what it would be like to come up against a heap of those barriers if you are one of our young ones that are in a particular circumstance. But Yeah, I'd say for the most part, yeah, hopefully relationships, like create some strong relationships and really mm, work on growing that self confidence and taking up opportunities as they arise. For me, the travel was a big thing. Whether that's everyone's cup of tea, it took me out of community for quite a bit. But I think that gave me the strength to come back. And like I said, so much was grown within me from that experience. And a lot of this preparedness, this appetite for life, I guess. Yeah, that's probably a good way of putting it. So I developed this appetite for life. I just want to soak it up as much as humanly possible in this relatively short period we have in this physical life. And um, yeah, I'm sure I could bang out a list of other little nuggets that I feel like might contribute to moving things forward. But that's probably the biggest one. If you had to put it to me, just be confident in yourself and pursue opportunities, be it education, be it professional, travel, personal, social, cultural. Things doors will open up and the world will grow exponentially as you take on uh, new opportunities and say yes to things.
Love it. Two more questions for you. Firstly, what are some other organisations that inspire you and whose work you admire?
Every Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community controlled organisation in Australia. I'm in awe of and have personally worked in several myself of what our community organisations are able to achieve in the face of just unrelenting adversity, intense underfunding, eternal understaffing, and just the sheer mandate that our orgs have, even if they sit squarely in a health, our housing organisations, our land councils, even within each of those service streams, the reality is for achieving positive outcomes for First Nations communities, you need to adopt a holistic perspective. It's got to be a broad frame consideration of all of the concurrent challenges that are facing clientele, like housing clientele, or say mob that are engaging our Aboriginal legal services for family or criminal law advice or assistance, support navigating the system. You can't afford to look at it in a siloed kind of way where it's we're just a legal service provider, so we'll focus exclusively on the criminal legal issues, and completely disregard the simultaneous family breakdown that's occurring and does occur across a lot of clients that we're seeing, and the housing instability that we're seeing, which often leads to bail refusals and leads to more children spending time on the streets, exposed to unhealthy social practices, which can lead to increased offending. God, you name it. There's any number of interrelated matters that each of our Aboriginal community orgs are so dialed into, because it's not just business to us. It's our lived, breathed reality. It's not a profession. It's not strictly a professional thing. It's not a 9 to 5. It's something that is our legacy, and for most of us, certainly for me, like as I said, like a responsibility, cultural responsibility, a modern framing of how we fulfil our responsibility. So, yeah, my hat's off to all mob that are working on the front line of service providers, Aboriginal health, Aboriginal medical services, Aboriginal housing services, Aboriginal legal services. I won't call out any specific organisations or individuals. I think it's appropriate. I think we're all in the trenches and extraordinarily resilient individuals, and doing amazing things in the face of an impossibly large task in Australia of creating socio-economic uplift for our people. And some of those all the statistics that we mentioned earlier, how our mob are in all the wrong places statistically, changing that up and ensuring more, coming from a base of voice, treaty, and truth to empower our communities to drive economic empowerment and see us take up our rightful places as enduring custodians. It's no mean feat, and we're in it daily. All of our First Nations community orgs, and I think it's commendable. So I'd call out every one of them.
Fantastic. And a final question for you, Blake. If people were to donate money to ANTAR, what sorts of things would that money go towards?
Yeah, well, if you've managed to last the entirety of this podcast, you would have heard earlier our current strategic advocacy priorities, and they're big ticket items. So rather than some of our First Nations service providers and the coalface of legal, housing, health service provision, we've got a critical role in working alongside some of our other First Nations advocacy organisations, for instance, namely Uluru Dialogues, to drive systemic change, that transformative structural reform, major overhaul of the way government does business, and ensuring that a policy and law reform is First Nations led, so that our people are front and centre, and such as the first line there, voice, that we have strong voice and that we decide about matters that affect us. Nothing about us without us. ANTAR, one of our primary focuses at this point in time, and has been for some, arguably the entire 30 years of our operation, or near 3 decades, is supporting First Nations advocacy organisations really to affect that structural reform and to mobilise wider Australia in that movement of the Australian people. So we are in a position where we can get things right in terms of criminal justice systems or criminal legal systems and health and housing. The whole closing the gap framework, my strong feeling is, unless we get the foundational structural stuff right, we close the power imbalance between our governments, state and territory, national governments, and First Nations communities, certainly until we close this seismic gap in resources, and we create truly self-determining communities where services are provided in a culturally responsive way and at scale. Unfortunately, I struggle to see how we're going to close any of those gaps. That funding is critical for us. We do an amazing job with the minimal funding base we have. I call our team a small but mighty team, and we've got a very, very clear understanding of, if we could only secure a bit more funding, the enormous work that we could achieve, and in particular working with broader Australia to create an ally base of the 97% of the population that's critical to affecting change, positive change for First Nations peoples, because 3% of the population advocating fiercely, whilst it's admirable and it's enormous, it's not going to affect the kind of change we need to see alone. We need the rest of Australia to come on that journey and to understand the issues and advocate as a collective for governments to do the right thing. We'd be utilising that money to expand our focus on supporting particularly grassroots community movements, reconciliation groups, and individuals to either become allies, or whom are already allies to become evolved allies, sometimes referred to them as accomplices. So actually come in right alongside First Nations peoples and be a part of the change that we want to see in this country.
Fantastic. Well, the idea with this podcast is that every month I want to feature a different not-for-profit organisation, and then I also run a Patreon where people can support the project, and half the money that comes in helps me to keep sharing more stories, and then the other half goes directly to the organisations featured. So I'll be sending that donation over to ANTAR very shortly. A big thank you to all the amazing people who support this project, and an even bigger thank you to you, Blake, for taking the time to chat with me today. I've followed ANTAR's work for many years, and you guys are making Australia a better place, not just for Indigenous Australians, but for all of us. So thank you.
I appreciate you having me on, and I appreciate you saying so, Brody. It's it's a real honour to be involved with ANTAR and its long, illustrious history, and I hope to be able to steer it towards another 30 years of amazing, fierce advocacy for, as you said, not just a better future for our First Nations communities, but all Australians. It's important work.
It certainly is. Well, yeah. Thanks again, Blake. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Brad.
That was Blake Cansdale, National Director of ANTAR. As always, I'd like to highlight 3 key points that Blake made, and the first is this one.
So it's really unfortunate that during the referendum, one of the things that was weaponised by the No campaign was part of this mis and disinformation, which we can talk a bit to, which was disastrous for the Yes campaign and really muddied the waters and I'd say in a large way undermined the referendum being genuinely representative of what Australia thought on the proposal.
When I look back on the Voice referendum, I see a proposal that had roughly 2/3 majority support for a number of months after it was announced. That was right up until Peter Dutton and the Coalition came out in opposition to it. And then a few months later, it had basically flipped to an almost 2/3 majority in the other direction. It was a deliberate, calculated political choice to seek division on a proposal that should have had bipartisan support. But one of the most heartbreaking elements was to see those people campaigning on a slogan of "If you don't know, vote no." That was one of our 2 major political parties actively discouraging democratic participation because it benefits them to have an uninformed public. If they'd run on a slogan of "If you don't know, find out," and laid out a clear argument for voting no, I could have respected that. I wouldn't have agreed with it, but I could have respected the outcome. But appealing to people's apathy in pursuit of political gain on an issue as important as this was utterly shameful. The next point I'd like to emphasise is this.
The privilege that I have had in my life of the, as I mentioned, my familial support, my upbringing, my educational opportunities. So there's some amazing education and career opportunities that gives me increasingly over the course of my adult life. That has given me an increasing sense of responsibility, deep sense of responsibility to leverage that for the betterment of, the world around me.
This is a really beautiful point. Privilege is a word that gets thrown around a lot these days, often in an almost derogatory sense. But privilege isn't inherently negative, at least not the kind of privilege that Blake is speaking about here. We're all trying to do our best with the random lottery ticket we've been handed, and Blake's framing is the perfect way to look at privilege. It's not a bad thing to have been dealt a lucky hand, but as Blake articulates, it does come with a responsibility to leverage that privilege for the betterment of the world around us. The final point I'd like to highlight is this.
That fire is always, if anything, it just like it douses the fire, it stokes the fire. The greater the challenges, the greater the resistance, the greater the seeming impossibility, the more I'm like, I need to be bigger. I need to be more in order to counter that.
I'm recording these reflections a few days after the most recent US election, which I wasn't planning on talking about in this podcast. But this line resonated so strongly with my feelings towards another 4 years of Trump. In the week leading up to the election, I had the opportunity to accompany an incredible group of conservation leaders from across the Americas on a journey into the Peruvian Amazon. I was just taking photos and producing media, but the conversations I had with each of them filled me with an intense optimism. They all had that fire that Blake is talking about, and there are millions of similarly passionate and dedicated people across the world. Whether it be tackling inequality or halting biodiversity loss or opposing genocide, whether it be grassroots or global, we haven't got the luxury of despair and apathy. We need to be bigger, we need to be more, and we need to keep that fire burning. If you'd like to support ANTAR, you can donate to them directly by visiting antar.org.au, and you can also follow their work on all the usual social media platforms. On behalf of all the amazing people who support this project, I was able to make a donation of $225 Australian to ANTAR. If you'd like to help me give more money to more amazing NGOs in the future, please consider signing up to the Patreon via the link in the show notes for as little as $5 a month. In the show notes, you'll also find further information about a range of topics that Blake and I discussed during this conversation. Another big thank you to everyone who supports this podcast, and to Blake Cansdale for being keen to chat with me about the incredible work of him and his team. I hope you found ANTAR as inspiring as I did, and I'll see you next month for another episode of Protect the World.